out today.
Okay, so it's just you and I.
It's just the two of us. So good.
It's just you and me. Gotta get my English correct there. It's just you and me.
Yes. Good morning, everyone, and welcome once again to Policy Matters with the Howard County Chamber. I'm Leonardo McClarty, president of the Chamber, and fortunate here to have with us this morning Delegate Eric Ebersole. And so my normal co-host here and Josh Bokee, Regulatory and External Affairs Manager with Comcast, unfortunately couldn't join us this morning as this is the legislative session and he does work in legislative and local affairs. Ended up having another meeting that had to grab him unexpectedly. And so we will have Josh back with us next week. But certainly it's always good to have Delegate Ebersole with us and will allow us to have just some good dialogue and conversation this morning. And so for those of you that perhaps are not as familiar with Delegate Ebersole, I'll just give a very brief intro and then allow him to say a few words on his behalf. And so he is a Baltimore County native and has actually grown up in the district that he currently represents in District 12, and as a lifelong educator, having spent over 30 years in teaching, and also comes from a long lineage of teachers and educators. And so certainly that's something that he's very passionate about, and he and I will talk certainly education this morning. But Delegate Ebersole, anything you want to say as we get things kicked off?
Well, first, to my good friend Josh Bokee, I hope he's not dodging me today because we get along. I like you a lot, Leonardo, and we work very well together, but I'm certainly going to miss having him around to ask a few questions and poke and prod a little bit too. No, a career as a teacher is really my life's work. But toward the end of it, the opportunity came to get elected to District 12. And I had done a lot of teaching and it was time to move on to something. I'm really loving this new job. Of course, it lets me focus on education in a completely different way. But there are other things, and we'll talk about those as well, if you like.
No. So I guess as we'll just jump right into things. And so, this year has certainly been an unusual session, much like the last year, in terms of how you guys are conducting business and meetings and so forth. But despite the way things are taking place from a meeting perspective, certainly there's still legislative priorities and things that you have your eye on. So maybe if you would just share a little bit about particular legislation that you're particularly interested in on a personal note, and then we'll just kind of go from there.
Yeah, and I could do this if you want me to, just talk a little bit about the logistics of us going back and meeting.
Yeah.
Today, meet. At 3 o'clock this afternoon, the House of Delegates has its first meeting. The Senate has been meeting, but if you've ever been to the Senate floor and the House floor, there's fewer senators, and they're not exactly next to each other. They're kind of walled off in what looks like a fun house. But we just couldn't do it in the House. There's 141 of us, and we're shoulder to shoulder, and it would be dangerous. So we're actually having 2 meeting places, one on the House floor and one in an annex, which is over in the House office building. And I get to be over there. It's going to be kind of fun and different and interesting over there to be there. But of course, those much apart. And we're going to wear masks, and we have a daily screening that we do on ourselves to make sure we're okay before we come in the building. We're really going to try to get through this session without an outbreak among the legislators, because we need most, if not all of them, there for most actions we take. So today's the first day. It's going to be a run through. It's going to be a little rough edges, I think, but we'll be taking up some overrides. Right at the start. We're required to do that. We did special order them at our brief meeting where we changed the rules and said it's okay for us to meet in 2 places. But now that's the first action you really have to take. And there are a handful of vetoes that the governor undertook. And we can drill down more on which ones you want me to. But of course, near and dear to me is something called the Blueprint for Maryland's Future. Many people call it Kerwin. That's not really its name. It was based on the 2-year study Kerwin Committee or Kerwin Commission did. And that bill was based on that. And we worked very hard. We had an early version of it in 2019 based on their preliminary reports. And then in 2020, we passed a more comprehensive bill, which goes forward for a decade or more in terms of improvements to education. And the governor vetoed that. I will say rather carefully that the governor used the economic distress of the pandemic as a reason for vetoing that and some other bills. I really, and this is my opinion, but I don't believe he would have allowed that bill to pass without his veto in any case, had there not even been a shutdown in March. Along with that, another education bill called Built to Learn, they were linked, which had to do with money for school construction. And there's a handful of others, but I can talk about whatever you would like me to.
So maybe let's go perhaps with the latter one, just because I think that's interesting on the Built to Learn, because in particular there's been also, I think and I don't know the exact numbers or what have you, but some other legislation around school construction. And
Right.
So I guess maybe help us all perhaps separate the two, because it's kind of interesting. On the one hand, you have one bill that obviously gets vetoed, but then you have another bill to come back to, at least from perhaps layman's eyes, that perhaps would appear to do the same thing. So maybe if you could help us kind of distinguish between the two.
Yeah, he didn't specifically veto the Built to Learn Act, but it contingent on passage of the blueprint. I hope he noticed that when he vetoed the blueprint, or maybe he just was in a bind and felt the blueprint was so opposed to us passing the blueprint that he did that. To me, there are really, unfortunately, there are only two bills, but there are three legs to me to a good education system. One is having really great programs and really great curriculum to present. The other one is to having a really credible and good people, staff and teachers and all the educators in the building to deliver that. And the third one is to have really great facilities. You have to have really great facilities, not just for the fact that it helps education if you have good computer labs and good CTE labs and things like that, but also because it helps with the overall feeling students have in a building if they feel like they're valued in a good building. The first two were taken care of by the blueprint because that's currently discussed. So we put those in the blueprint. And then the speaker felt that we needed to ramp up. And, we're really aware of it, especially in the Baltimore County part of our district. Lansdowne High School is perhaps one of the lower rated schools in the county, certainly the lowest rated school in the county, maybe in the state, that it's just its current condition, it's crumbling. And those kind of schools need to be either renovated or rebuilt going forward. The time has come. These schools are old. And so when we overturn the blueprint, that will reactivate the Built to Learn Act also, which is, we already have school construction money in the budget. This just ramped it up a bit over the next several years.
And for those that are watching, if you don't know, and I meant to mention this earlier, but Delegate Ebersole serves on the House Ways and Means Committee, and so education, and he sits on the Education Committee. Matter of fact, you chair the early childhood.
Early childhood, which is a lesser version of the education, but it handles all the bills that fall into early childhood or special education and libraries. But that committee manages those bills as they come through as well. And so we've had a lot to do in that committee, worrying about childcare, especially. And we talk about that, the businesses of childcare in the pandemic.
Yeah. Well, and I mention that just so that, again, for those joining us, I mean, certainly when we talk about education, the fact that it's coming, it's one thing for it to be a passion. It's another thing when it's also a committee that you sit on, because you truly get a chance to see all of the nuances and how things come together and so forth, as opposed to just waiting until it gets to the floor and then it's kind of presented to you and you've kind of and you listen to the deliberations. But in this case, you're actually at the committees and then actually the behind the scenes committee meetings and discussion as well. So I think all of that is very pertinent. Something that's been a big discussion, obviously, has been around the pandemic in education. And so this was what I was going to ask you about. It was interesting. I was watching CNN yesterday, and there's some legislation that's being introduced in Florida. And one of it is by a state senator there that, in essence, it was talking about just the number of disparities between, various kids, whether it's economic, whether it's racial, what have you, but and how some kids are just failing. And so ultimately, she had introduced legislation that would allow parents to actually hold back their kids if they saw they were struggling. And so I was curious, just kind of your thoughts as an educator, and if there had even been any discussions like that here in Maryland, just because, again, we're hearing all of these stories about, whether it's digital divide issues or what have you.
Geez, Leonardo, you're about to make my head explode with a number of questions. We'll start by saying that we knew we had gaps in our education system. By the way, the blueprint was designed to help make those better, not exacerbate, make them better, ameliorate them. Students who live in concentrations of poverty in the state, and special ed students, and students who are English language learners, for example, are just a few groups. Also, we can't ignore sometimes poverty and race run together, and that's something we need to cure socially in a large way. But we see big gaps. The gaps existed long before the pandemic, but the pandemic has certainly made some of them worse. And we're sure that we're going to be actually having to evaluate that when we have access to students and begin to be able to sort of get some testing done and do some evaluation of where they stand. But we're very concerned when they come back. And you're right, that's an interesting solution. I've heard it presented. It would be an expensive solution because when you consider that, there are still students coming up from young that would be coming to our schools. We would be keeping students in our schools. So we would just have many more students all of a sudden if we did that on the back end. So it's a tough decision. When you talk about special ed communities, special ed students actually sort of max out at a certain age. I think it's 20. And then after that, we no longer can send them to public schools. There's a bill in this year by Delegate Guyton to actually extend their availability for a year at least, because I think in many ways, and we had a briefing on this, the students who are special needs are in some cases the least able to adapt to this sort of learning, the online learning, and having some real trouble. Some are doing fine, but more generally they're having troubles. So that worries me. But that's a broad solution. I'd be interested to see if Florida does it. Florida, they're willing to step up line sometimes, so it'd be good to see what they do.
Well, and it'll be interesting to see what happens there, because as the person that was talking, the state senator, so Florida is just the opposite of Maryland politically. And so this was a Democrat in Florida introducing this bill on the Senate side. And so, but the one thing she did say, and we know certainly how important this is, I think she said it passed unanimously out of her committee, which certainly in today's world of bipartisanship and sometimes lack thereof, that's a big deal. And
right.
And so and I will say this, I think she had it only going K through 8. And primarily, and her rationale, which, in some respects, just quickly, not to spend too much time there, made sense, was that, her comments were that ultimately it's the kids K through 8 that oftentimes aren't able to truly verbalize perhaps how well they're doing or not doing. Whereas, high school, the general theme is that a kid can say, hey, you know what, I'm just not getting this. Then you mix in sports and extracurricular activities and potentially scholarships to college. And it just, obviously has a whole number of different nuances. So certainly
I have a kindergarten grandchild who I'm doing some daycare with. Some days my wife and I watch him, and I've watched him online, and he's new. Kindergarten in particular, I think, because I didn't know any of the kids from the year before they came in. But I have watched him improve significantly in his ability, and the schools, are going to go back on March 1st, and parents have to make decisions if they want their kids to go back. And my daughter and her husband are wrestling with this, and there's a reason for that, because people imagine that when we send kids back, it's going to look like it used to look. That's not the classroom together and outside at recess playing. Some of the elementary schools say, we're not having recess. Send along something for your kids to do during downtimes. And mostly the kids will be sitting at desks with some protection around them, and they will be online much as they would be at home. They'll be in school, and then it'll be up to the teacher how much they are comfortable interacting with them. So it's not going to be a return to normalcy when these kids go back to school when they go back. So I'm concerned that that's, first of all, the image people have. But you're right. I think, coming back to your question, I think the earlier grades have had a lot more adjustments to do. There's, high schoolers are more mature. They do know how to adjust. And I've heard some high schoolers who really like it because it gives them a certain freedom to manage things. So I think that's, thank you for pointing that out. I'm going to follow that bill. I want to see what happens.
Yeah. So it's interesting. So, as parents of 3 school-age kids, we're, dealing with the same thing. And we, I have one in 8th grade and 2 that are in 2nd grade. And it's interesting. My 8th grader was in no rush to go back. She was just like, hey, I like the virtual. And actually, as parents, we ended up making a decision to have ours remain virtual just because, we just said, well, it doesn't, in our opinion, for us, didn't make sense to have them go back to school to do the same things that they could do here at home.
And you're going to have to let me wax political for a second here. I can't help but think that you're thinking of the safety of your children a little bit and yourselves. That I think, we set up a lot of metrics for when we would want to send kids back. And then Governor Hogan just kind of said, well, never mind all that. I want you to start school on the 1st. And he made some threats that I thought were unfounded, but I don't think he had the power to. But he talked about teachers who would make a decision not to come back because they felt they would be in danger, or family members would be. They might lose their certificates. That concerns me, not only because I think it's not a good lead, but also because I feel like, and I have lots of teacher friends still. They liked me when I taught, so they still that, or they think I can do something in the legislature. Mm-hmm. There's a problem with morale right now among teachers. They're feeling sort of objectified and not sure that they're valued. And they're very concerned about that, especially since there's not enough vaccine to go around. And the state superintendent said, well, it's not a prerequisite for people to go back. And she said, vaccines make people feel better. Well, that's not correct. Vaccines make people better. They don't make you just feel better about it. They don't make you more comfortable. They actually make you able to be more healthy. So I'm concerned about all those things with the return. And I'm sure when parents like you are making decisions about that, you are thinking not only of their ability, what's the best learning environment for them, but also maybe what's the best health environment for them at the same time.
No, you're correct. And I'm the son of a retired elementary and middle school principal. And so certainly also would say just not to spend too much time on it, but also understand just the importance too. When you start talking about, licensure and contracts with teachers and so forth, I mean, it's paramount to your livelihood and so forth. So it's a big deal, but kind of moving on, something else obviously that's going to be interesting, this, I guess it was maybe Friday or so, the Senate side passed the $1.5 billion relief package, which now comes over to the House. And so I understand that while I think there's general support, I know the House has perhaps some of its own perhaps thoughts or particulars. Anything that you're hearing there as it relates to, what might be of importance to the House that perhaps either may not have been, as important, or at least was just perhaps phrased differently in the Senate side?
So I haven't seen the amendments yet. I have the fiscal note on the bill, and they talked about them, and I made a few notes. Kudos to the Senate. It's hard for me to say that because I'm not the Senate. There's a certain amount of work better than you with those guys, and these, of course. That they took what was the governor's suggestion of $900 million and ramped it up to make it even more robust. And there are some things in there that I think are really valuable and that we're going to need to do. One of them is forgiving some of the loans and making them into grants for businesses. The only thing that worries me about that one is that some businesses were unable to get those loans because the system was stressed and couldn't meet it. And I feel like they have to be made whole too, just because somebody managed to, buy the ticket at Ticketron is what it feels like. They got in to the systems that they still be made whole. I also noticed that the bill talks about revamping how we compute UI taxes for businesses. I think that I'm not an expert on that, but the way it looks to me is we're trying to make that so that this doesn't distort what people have to put into the UI going forward. So I feel really good about those. There's a couple other really good things in there. Personally, there's also a bill by a delegate named Jared Solomon, because of my interest in daycare. One of the things that people have in their minds is that daycare and some of the pre-Ks are sort of like public schools, like they're going to be there no matter what. But that's not true. Daycare sometimes not-for-profits, or they are businesses, and they can disappear. And daycares are what I call the workforce behind the workforce. We need to have those so that people can go to work. Many people rely on them. And Jared Solomon has a grant program specifically directed at those businesses, at those daycare businesses, to try to keep them whole. Some of them have really struggled. So there's a lot of good things in this bill, and it does come to our committee. I'm not on the revenue subcommittee in Ways and Means, so I haven't drilled down on it quite as tightly. But we did have our briefing, and basically the Senate passed it quickly because they know it's important. There are some things that need to be fixed. And when we said, hey, what about this and what about that, and I can't remember all the details there, they said, well, you guys can do. We want you to fix it up too. They got the ball rolling. Now we catch it and figure out if everything is as it should be. We're looking at details here and there on that.
And so going back to that child care piece, because that was something I know that was, really big, that was discussed. Perhaps it hasn't been talked about as much now, but I know that kind of going back to the summer time of last year, and as we were in some places starting to prepare for kind of phase one of reopenings and so forth. And I know the U.S. Chamber did a big focus on kind of 5 areas of interest that could really impact business, and childcare was one. And so kind of from your committee thus far, and I guess maybe on the business side, what's perhaps been discussed in terms of trying to provide maybe additional support for childcare? So I know that was because childcares were kind of in this dichotomy, in the sense that from a business standpoint, they were being impacted because they couldn't have but so many employees or kids in a center. But yet at the same time, if you're trying to open the economy, and for some people that, whether you're, at a hospital or a grocery store or a warehouse, you can't necessarily do those things remote. And so yet you've got, fewer places to take your children, but yet the places that are taking your children can't be at full capacity.
Right. And in the early going, there was some problem with ratios. It's generally 9 to 1, 10 people in a room, but then they went 15, and some of the daycare switched over to that, but then they got ramped back where they could have 2 to 18. And it was hard for them because they were having to pivot. And of course, with schools not being open for in-class work, there were a bunch of school-age children that suddenly needed childcare because their parents still had to go to work. And counties, Howard County did a great job pivoting on that by creating some centers where students could go and be monitored in what was considered a very safe way. And I've heard of no outbreaks. And Columbia Association did that as well. In the Columbia schools, they basically took the schools where there were after-school programs and used them in a very empty way. People say, well, if they can go back there, why can't they come back to school? Well, the answer is we were sending far, far fewer students in for that, and the conditions were much more controlled. I do rail, if you'll let me just digress for a second. We'll say that teachers need to go back to work and schools need to reopen. Hospitals have, and grocery store workers are. And my answer is you for yourself can think of so many ways that a school setting is not the same as a grocery store or a hospital. Hospital has a lot of control over where people are. There's a lot more disease there. Grocery store, it's a lot less of the sort of random contact that you see. A school is a little bit chaotic at times, and trying to keep that down. So this has been an effort. And like I said, Delegate Jared Solomon and I worked really hard. He's in appropriations. So he took lead on a bill that would create grants for childcare centers to keep them viable. We weren't allowed to co-sponsor bills this year because it meant when you co-sponsor, you have to hand bills off personally to each other, and they didn't.
Okay.
But I feel as if I am the lead co-sponsor with him on that bill, because I have, it's funny when I got childcare, early childhood as my committee, then you learn about things, and I know much, much more about childcare in the state of children, youth, and families in the state than I did before. And as I said, child cares work hard, but they are sort of a foundational support for workers across the state.
And I think this was one of those that also, and I didn't know this until kind of obviously the whole pandemic hit, but that for many that advocate for childhood and early childhood and daycares and so forth, this has been one of those kind of issues that's been kind of almost like a slow boil over the several years in terms of how they're funded and just the host of issues that kind of impact, I guess, daycares and so forth. And like many things, that the pandemic just kind of really exposed a number of the challenges that they're facing and so forth.
Yeah, how we were sort of living on the edge with these businesses, and how they were living on the edge, their margins and their revenues, and how this hurt them. I mean, a number have closed. Some will reopen, but it's going to be interesting to see how it shakes out when we feel like we're getting closer back to normal. I think it'll be a long, long time till we feel like we're normal again. But when we're getting closer back, it'll be interesting to see. And the blueprint, and we did a little bit in the original version. The larger version expands pre-K, which many child care centers are Excel rated. That's the rating system in the state, and they can offer pre-K, and they can even, because we didn't have the facilities, we didn't ask the public schools to do all the pre-K. We have a partnership, what we call mixed delivery system, and so there's pressure on them too, because if they're going to take state funds, they need to open up and be available to students who want to, who can access them for pre-K. And so, yeah, it's a whole area. And, there's a fair amount of evidence that students are not as much prone to getting COVID. Nobody's really sure how much they can spread it. The whole thing is, if you have a vaccine, it doesn't mean you're not dangerous. It means that you won't. It doesn't mean you might not be carrying it to someone while you're fighting it off with your vaccine, or if you had it before and you have the antibodies. So yeah, they have their challenges, and they have, one of the most difficult populations to manage, because 3, 4, 5-year-olds don't sometimes, so yeah. It's a huge challenge, and I'm secretly glad I'm not a daycare teacher right now.
Yeah, and so just one quick question, kind of before we maybe our last question is of kind of shifting on a business side. But so you've got Blueprint that we talked about, but at the same time, as you've looked at Blueprint and now you've looked at everything that's taken that's I guess occurred as a result of the pandemic, what perhaps I guess maybe legislation is being considered that kind of picks off in some respects where Blueprint left, or at least that you've already identified some gaps in Blueprint. And again, whether it's, internet access or what have you, but just curious.
That's a great question, Leonardo, because what I say to people is, you can't overturn a Blueprint because things have changed. And I said, but that's why we meet in the legislature every year, because that was a bill we passed last year. We feel like it should already be law. In either case, we would have done what we're doing now, which is there is a new bill that we're working on, and I don't have all the details because I'm not one of the writers of that one. I'm a little disappointed about that, but that will adjust the Blueprint somewhat based on things that need to be adjusted, especially financially, but also in terms of programming. On the other hand, we're going to redirect some funds, because I was on a committee that looked at the impacts of virtual learning. And like I said, I talked about curriculum gaps, but there are also mental health considerations as students come back to schools. Students have been in difficult situations or just didn't deal well with being home. When they come back, they're going to be in shock too. So we're going to be looking at ways to mitigate that. We're going to be ramping up after school programs and summer programs to try to catch kids up. The very kids that they're talking about in Florida, they need another year. We'd like to be able to actually bring them up to speed if we can by school programs for them. And so there are changes. Some of them will be expanding some things, but we will be contracting a few things too. We're rational. We see reality. The damage to the economy wasn't as bad as originally predicted, but it's still bad, and we're going to have some work to do.
And so maybe our last question as we get ready to wrap up here, and that is, so I had an opportunity to actually go before your committee, I guess a couple of weeks ago, and talking about the angel investor tax credit, and so just from a business standpoint, what are perhaps been maybe just a few bills that have come before Ways and Means that, not necessarily saying you guys have voted but just that as you've listened, that you said, wow, that's kind of an interesting concept, or just from a business perspective that you've kind of heard or that you guys have taken up?
Well, I've been a co-sponsor of that angel investment every year. I was allowed to be. Like I said, this year not.
Okay.
I think that we have a number of bills, and we've been doing it for years. I haven't seen many yet this year that are designed to kickstart businesses in important areas. We've done it in the area of renewable energy. We've done it in areas of biotechnology. And really, we're kind of glad we did that now, aren't we? Kept the company Maryland, like AstraZeneca, giving them incentives. People say that's a big company, but they're doing good things, and they're one of the ones that's going to come up with a vaccine if they don't have one already. So we do try to incentivize things. We try to look forward. We try to incentivize things that are in the future for us. And on the education side, we are being very careful to focus on career and technology education training, not just preparing kids. College and career ready. Career is always second in that statement, but I think it's just as important that kids who don't want to pursue a college program to get to their job readiness, there are other jobs, and some of them very well paying, that we try to incentivize for kids too. So I really enjoy that part, that we look toward providing a workforce for businesses from education, not just through a four-year college, but also through programs. And our scholarships that we're allowed to offer are allowed to include trade schools and things like that. So I think it's very valuable.
No, and I would certainly echo that I think that, for far too long, I think we have spent too much time just trying to just say college is the end all be all, where we know that there are a number of jobs, and particularly, I would even not so much say jobs, I'm going to say careers. Because you can get a job anywhere. But in terms of when you're talking about, you can be the greeter at Walmart if you really want to. Yeah, right. But when you're talking about careers, that's the big thing that I think we really have to look at long term, in terms of whether, again, it's technical or 2-year school. And
our community colleges have a wealth of programs in that direction that students can take that may or may not lead to an AA degree, but don't have to necessarily. They have truck driver schools, and they have lots and lots of things that are legitimate and good career paths for people. So, I always think it was no accident that we said college and career readiness rather than career and college readiness. Yeah. I don't think they should come in any particular order, to be honest with you. Career comes first, so maybe it should be first, So
yeah, excellent. Well, we have reached the end of our time, and so okay. we recognize that we could always talk longer, but certainly we know that for those that have tuned in, on the screen, 30 minutes is about all that we could typically take. And also, for those of us with school age, that it's time for them to get logged on. And I know some attention will start being diverted. But
you can see I'm still at home this morning, but I got to pack my bag and get down to Annapolis today. So,
but definitely thank you for joining us. And for those tuning in, we'll be back next week at the same time, 8:30, and we'll have with us Delegate Vanessa Atterbury. And so who's vice chair of judiciary. And so we'll be shifting our attention to talk about some things going on in her committee. Also this month, as well as the county, is a state of business address that we will host with County Executive Dr. Calvin Ball on February 24th. And so there are a host of other events taking place at the Chamber. Visit us at www.howardchamber.com. And also, again, I want to thank Comcast for their support of Policy Matters, and we will talk to you all next week. Thank you.
Thank you.